she returned his engagement ring publicly, set it down on a DJ table in front of 200 members of her family, and told him she wanted him gone by Monday. He picked it up, put it in his pocket, and said nothing. What she did not know, what none of them knew, was that the quiet man she had just humiliated in front of everyone she had ever loved was the sole director of a $46.7 billion technology empire. That the construction business her brother had spent 3 years calling his greatest achievement existed almost entirely because that quiet man's grandfather had needed somewhere to put his servers, and that the moment she placed that ring on the DJ table, she had not freed herself from a man with nothing. She had declared war on a man who owned everything, and he had already decided calmly, without anger, to let her find that out the hard way. The question is not whether she lost everything. The question is how long it took her to understand that she never had what she thought she had in the first place. If this story is already hitting, go ahead and tap that like button right now. It tells us to keep bringing you stories like this one. Subscribe if you're new here, because we do this every week and you do not want to miss what's coming. And drop your city in the comments. Where are you watching from today? We've got people tuning in from everywhere and we want to know where you're at. Now let me take you back to where this all started. Back to a Saturday evening in Inglewood, California, inside a rented banquet hall where 200 people were laughing, eating, and about to witness something that none of them would stop talking about for the rest of the year, though not for the reasons any of them expected. The banquet hall on Century Boulevard had been rented out by the Chambers family every August for 11 years running, and by 7 o'clock on that particular Saturday evening, it was doing exactly what it always did, breathing loud and warm with the particular energy of 200 people who shared blood and a rotating cast of grievances they were too well dressed to mention directly. The DJ had the music going. Someone's aunt was already on the floor. The catering trays along the far wall held mac and cheese with the crispy top still intact, candied yams that smelled like brown sugar, and Sunday morning fried catfish that had drawn a line 3 people deep from the moment the lids came off. Children ran between tables in clothes their mothers had already warned them about. Old men sat near the exits with plates piled high, talking about nothing and everything the way old men do when they've earned the right to take up space without justification. James Ellington, Booker, sat at table 9. He had a glass of water in front of him and a plate he had not touched. He was wearing a navy blazer over a white shirt, no tie, the kind of outfit that reads as quietly put together to people who aren't looking closely, and as unremarkable to everyone else. No one at the surrounding tables had spoken to him directly in the past 40 minutes. A cousin of Vanessa's had nodded at him on the way to the buffet. That was the sum of it. James did not appear to mind. He had spent 9 years attending this reunion, and 9 years had taught him exactly what kind of room it was. It was Terrell's room. It had always been Terrell's room. The rest of them were just eating inside it. Terrell Chambers materialized at the front of the hall the way he always did, not announced, not invited, simply inevitable. He was 44 years old, broad-shouldered, and dressed in a cream linen suit that cost more than he would ever admit and less than he implied. He had the microphone before the DJ understood what was happening, and he had the crowd's attention before Terrell had even said a word, because this was the part of the evening the family had come to expect the way they expected the catfish and the DJ and the children ruining their good clothes. Terrell's talent show appearance was never actually about talent. He started where he always started, with himself. The business, the contracts, the square footage of his new office space in Culver City, the truck he'd just paid off. The crowd gave him what he wanted, which was the particular approving laughter of people who had decided someone was successful and were willing to perform their belief in that conclusion on demand. Then he shifted. It was subtle enough that a stranger might have missed it, but no one at table 9 missed it. "I was raised," Terrell said, pausing for effect, rolling the microphone cord between 2 fingers, "to believe that a man takes care of his family, not halfway, not on paper, all the way." He let his eyes drift across the room with the practiced casualness of a man who had rehearsed the direction of his gaze. They landed on table 9. They stayed there. "My father worked doubles. My uncles worked doubles. The men in this family," he said, his voice rising just enough, "show up." The laughter built slowly, the way a fire builds when the wood is already dry. Loretta Chambers, seated 2 tables to James's left, said nothing. She smoothed the front of her dress and looked at the centerpiece. Vanessa laughed. It was not a big laugh. It was not cruel in any obvious way. It was the laugh of a woman who had made a private decision and was only now letting it show in public, the way a coat slides off a shoulder before anyone has been told it's warm enough to remove it. James looked at the table. He did not look at Terrell. He did not look at Vanessa. He looked at the tablecloth, which was white and cheap, and had a small grease stain near the edge from someone's plate, and he sat with the particular stillness of a man who has learned that stillness is its own form of answer. That was when the door opened. It was a side entrance, near the emergency exit sign that buzzed faintly in the corner. The man who stepped through it was dressed in a charcoal suit, fitted, no pocket square, carrying nothing. He was not a Chambers. He was not anyone James had introduced to this family, or this room, or this version of his life. He scanned the hall with the efficiency of someone who already knew what he was looking for, found it at table 9, and gave a single nod. Brief, definite, the kind of nod that carries information, before stepping back through the door and letting it close behind him. James's expression did not change, not by a degree. Vanessa did not see it. She was already standing. She crossed the room with the certainty of a woman who had been waiting a long time to stop pretending she was not moving towards something. She took the microphone from her brother the way you take something that was always meant for you. She turned to face the room, 200 faces turning with her, and she said what she had decided she would say. Her voice was clear. It did not waver. "James, the first have been trying to figure out how to tell you this for a long time, and I think this is the right place." The DJ faded the music, not all the way. Just enough. "I want a divorce, and I want you out of the house by Monday." She pulled the ring from her finger. She walked to the DJ table, set it down on the edge next to a cup of cables and a half-finished water bottle, and walked back to her seat without looking at her husband again. The DJ did not know what to play. He played nothing. 200 people held the specific silence of a crowd that has just watched something they will describe for the rest of their lives and argue about the details of at the next reunion. James sat for a moment. Then he stood, straightened his blazer, and walked to the DJ table. He picked up the ring. He looked at it once, at the way you look at something you already understand, and placed it in the breast pocket of his jacket. He walked to the woman at the welcome table near the entrance, a cousin of Vanessa's named Brenda, who had been organizing these reunions for 6 years, and he thanked her for putting the evening together. He meant it. Then he walked out. The August air outside was warm and still, and smelled like the dry grass of the parking lot, and James Ellington Booker walked to his Toyota Camry, unlocked it, and sat behind the wheel for exactly 90 seconds before he started the engine and drove away. The man in the charcoal suit was not in the parking lot. He didn't need to be. He had already delivered his message, and James had already understood it. The room he had just left would spend the rest of that night talking about what Vanessa had done. Not one person in it would think to wonder about the man at the door, to understand what happened at that banquet hall and why James Ellington Booker responded to it the way he did. You have to go back further than that Saturday evening in August. You have to go back 9 years. Because what looked like one night of cruelty was actually the last page of a very long story that the Chambers family had been writing without fully understanding what they were putting on paper. James had always been an early riser. By 5:30 most mornings he was already dressed, already moving through the kitchen with the particular quiet efficiency of a man who had learned not to disturb the peace of a house that did not always feel like his own. He made coffee, packed his lunch, usually leftovers from whatever he had cooked the night before, stored in a container his mother had given him years ago, and drove the Camry downtown before the freeways filled. He was at his office by 6:45. He rarely left before 7 in the evening. He never brought the work home. He never explained it to anyone. Vanessa had asked, in the early years, she had asked what clients he managed, what firms he worked with, what exactly private investment advising looked like on a Tuesday afternoon. James answered every question warmly and in terms that were technically accurate and revealed nothing. He was not lying to her. He was protecting something that had nothing to do with her and everything to do with a promise he had made to a man who was no longer alive to receive it. Vanessa stopped asking around year 3. By then, Loretta had already delivered her verdict. Loretta Chambers had opposed the marriage before she had finished her first conversation with James. She was a woman of precise social calibration. She could read a man's earning potential the way some women read weather by feel, by small signals invisible to those who had not spent a lifetime watching for them. James had no signals she recognized. No firm name to drop, no car that announced anything, no easy answer to the question of what he did and what it was worth. She had told Vanessa the week after the engagement that James was polite but purposeless, and she had said it with the particular gentleness of a woman who believed she was performing an act of love. It became the family's quiet consensus, not announced, just agreed upon, the way families agree on things that are never quite said directly enough to be argued with. Terrell's contributions were less subtle. Every year at the reunion, Terrell used the microphone to remind the family what a successful man looked like. He talked about his contracts, his crew sizes, his trucks. He talked about his new office space in Culver City, first the lease, then the expansion, then the renovation. He talked about making it on his own, about never taking a handout, about the value of a man who builds something real with his hands. And every year he found a way to deliver these remarks with his eyes drifting, eventually, to wherever James was sitting. It was not always the reunion. There was a Thanksgiving, James's third, with the Chambers family. When Loretta had looked down the dinner table at the moment James declined a second helping, and said pleasantly, to no one in particular, that she admired people who were content with very little. The table had laughed. James had thanked her for the meal. There was the afternoon Terrell had shown up at the house uninvited and offered, over a glass of sweet tea in the kitchen, to put James in touch with a general contractor who was always looking for reliable site supervisors. He had framed it as a favor. James had thanked him for thinking of him and changed the subject. And there was the trip to Puerto Vallarta that Vanessa had booked for their 7th anniversary and cancelled 3 weeks before departure, telling James that the dates no longer worked and telling Loretta in a separate conversation that she was tired of being asked by other couples what her husband did for a living and not having an answer that landed correctly. James never retaliated, not once, not in any form. He went to the office, he managed the trust, he came home, he cooked dinner and left Vanessa's portion warm on the stove if she was late, which she often was. Terrell's business, Chambers Premier Build, had done well enough in those years. 4 years of subcontracting work through Meridian Pacific Construction, federal infrastructure projects, data center builds, secure facility work across Southern California, $18.3 million in total contract value across that period. Terrell talked about it constantly. He had built that number into his identity the way some men build their names into the side of their trucks. It was the evidence he offered the world that he was exactly who he said he was. Loretta had co-signed his business line of credit to the tune of $2.3 million because she believed in him without reservation. She had moved into a comfortable house in Baldwin Hills 3 years ago, a house whose comfort depended entirely on Terrell's continued success. She did not think of it that way. She thought of it as the natural order of things, as what happened when a family raised its children right, and they went out and built something real. Nobody in the Chambers family asked what company Meridian Pacific worked for primarily. Nobody asked whose contracts were at the end of the chain. It had simply never occurred to any of them to follow the money back to its source. 6 months before the reunion, Vanessa sat in her mother's kitchen after Sunday dinner and told Loretta that she had made up her mind. She wasn't unhappy in any dramatic way. She was done. There was a difference, she explained, and Loretta nodded like a woman who had been waiting to hear this exact sentence for years. "I just need to find the right moment," Vanessa said. Loretta refilled her daughter's glass of iced tea and said that patience was its own kind of wisdom. The right moment, it turned out, was chosen for maximum audience. The offices of Hargrove and Wills LLP occupied the 14th floor of a building on Figueroa Street that had a lobby with real marble floors and a security desk staffed by a man who knew James by name. James had been coming to this building for 13 years. He took the elevator up, nodded to the receptionist, and was shown to the conference room without being asked to wait. Patricia Hargrove was already there. She was 58 years old, small and precise, with reading glasses she kept on a chain around her neck, and a way of arranging documents on a table that suggested she had already thought through every possible direction a conversation might go, and had prepared accordingly. She had been managing the Booker-Ellington Family Trust since James was 29 years old. She had known his grandfather. She did not waste words. "I heard," she said when James sat down. He nodded once. That was enough. She slid a folder across the table. Not the folder, not yet, just the preliminary documentation, the trust summary, the asset overview, the kind of document James could recite from memory, but which Patricia believed in reviewing together, formally, whenever circumstances changed. Circumstances had changed. She began where she always began, with Calvin. Calvin Ellington Booker had built his first technology services company in 1971 out of a rented office in Compton with 2 employees and a contract to maintain mainframe systems for the county. By 1987, when he established the Booker-Ellington Family Trust, he had quietly assembled a portfolio of technology holdings that most of the industry had not yet thought to categorize together. He was not a man who sought recognition. He was a man who sought position. There was a difference, and Calvin understood it at a cellular level. He put everything, every company, every contract, every controlling interest inside the trust. He named his grandson as sole beneficiary. He told James about it the summer James turned 19, sitting on the porch of the house on Hooper Avenue with 2 glasses of lemonade and the particular gravity of a man transferring something irreplaceable. James had become trust director at 28 when Calvin died. What the trust controlled, as of that Monday morning in late August, was Ellington Systems Group, a private technology holding company with a combined portfolio valuation of $46.7 billion, enterprise software platforms used by 14 state governments, federal defense technology contracts spanning the Army, the Navy, and the Department of Homeland Security. Infrastructure SaaS products managing cloud operations for over 300 corporate clients across 23 states, 4,900 employees who had never heard of James Ellington Booker and had no reason to, because James had structured the trust precisely to ensure that his name appeared nowhere a casual search would find it. Patricia let the numbers sit in the room for a moment. Then she said, "There's something else I want you to see." She had pulled the vendor dependency analysis 3 weeks ago, she explained, as part of a routine audit of Ellington Systems infrastructure build-out contracts. She had not called James about it at the time because it had not yet been relevant. It was relevant now. Meridian Pacific Construction, the general contractor that served as the primary pipeline for a subcontracting firm called Chambers Premier Build, had been Ellington Systems' preferred construction partner for federal infrastructure projects for 4 years running. Every server farm, every data center annex, every secure facility that Ellington Systems had broken ground on across Southern California and Nevada had been built, at least in part, through Meridian Pacific. And Meridian Pacific's contract volume with Ellington Systems represented 81% of their total annual revenue, which meant that Chambers Premier Build, Terrell's company, the source of Terrell's $18.3 million in subcontracting income, the foundation of every self-made speech he had ever delivered into a microphone, existed almost entirely because Ellington Systems needed somewhere to pour its concrete. James had known this for 2 years. He had never once considered using it. Patricia watched him absorb this information the way she had watched him absorb difficult information for over a decade, without visible reaction, without the kind of noise that lesser men made when they suddenly understood the size of something. He was quiet for a long moment. Outside, 14 floors down, Figueroa Street moved through its Monday morning in complete indifference. Then Patricia told him about Vanessa's attorney. The filing would come within weeks, she said. Standard discovery in a California divorce proceeding. His attorney would receive the inquiry, the trust structure would need to be disclosed in broad terms, and while the irrevocable nature of the Booker-Ellington family trust legally insulated the overwhelming majority of its assets from any marital claim, the process of establishing that insulation would not be invisible. Vanessa's attorney would see the name Ellington Systems Group. They would search it. What they found would not be what they were expecting. James sat with that for a moment too. Then he asked the only question that mattered. "What are my options?" Patricia did not answer immediately. She reached to the side of the table, picked up a second folder, thicker than the first, tabbed and organized, and set it down in front of him with the deliberate calm of a woman who had already done the work and was simply waiting for the authorization to use it. She said they could move as quietly or as loudly as James decided. He pulled the folder toward him and opened it to the first page. The slow burn was over. The folder contained 11 pages. James read all of them at the table in Hargrove's conference room, with Patricia sitting across from him in the particular patient silence that distinguished her from every other attorney he had ever encountered. She did not summarize, she did not prompt. She simply waited for him to finish reading because she understood that the man across from her did not make decisions until he had read everything, and that once he had read everything, he did not need long. He closed the folder. The strategy was clean, which was the only kind James respected. 2 tracks running simultaneously, neither one touching the other in any way that could be characterized as retaliatory or targeted. The first track was legal. Patricia would file the preliminary divorce response within 48 hours, with asset disclosures structured entirely around the irrevocable nature of the Booker-Ellington family trust. The trust had been established 37 years ago, well before any marriage, well before any community property claim could attach. Vanessa's attorney would receive the filing and discover page by carefully organized page that the marital estate they had assumed was simple and navigable was in fact a single small clearing at the edge of a very large forest they had not known existed. The trust itself would remain protected, but its existence would not. The second track was business. Ellington Systems Group conducted routine vendor reviews every quarter. This was not unusual, it was not targeted. It was simply the kind of operational discipline that a $46.7 billion technology holding company maintained as a matter of standard practice. The upcoming review of Meridian Pacific Construction's preferred contractor status was already on the schedule. It had been on the schedule before the reunion. All that was required was for the review to proceed on its normal timeline, without interference and without any instruction to produce any outcome in particular. James did not instruct Patricia to produce any outcome in particular. He simply told her to let the process run. They wrapped up by noon. James took the elevator down to the lobby, nodded to the security desk and drove 6 blocks to the Ellington Systems Group downtown office. A floor and a half in a building on Grand Avenue that bore no signage connecting it to the company's name, a deliberate choice his grandfather had made in 1994, and James had never seen reason to reverse. The receptionist greeted him. His chief of staff, a man named Roland Pitts, was waiting at the conference room door. Roland Pitts was 41 years old, methodical and constitutionally incapable of small talk. He was also the man in the charcoal suit who had stood in the doorway of a banquet hall in Inglewood on a Saturday evening 3 days ago and delivered a nod that carried 3 words of information without a single one being spoken. I was there. I saw. Monday. James had hired Roland 11 years ago. Roland had never once overstepped his role. He had also never once failed to be exactly where James needed him. James told Roland to initiate the standard vendor audit of Meridian Pacific. Routine review. No urgency communicated, no special parameters. Roland wrote 1 line in his notebook, closed it, and said he would have the notification out by end of day. That was the entire conversation. After Roland left, James sat alone in his office for a few minutes. The room was spare, a desk, 2 chairs, a lamp, a window that looked out over Grand Avenue. There was one personal object in the entire space. It hung on the wall to the left of the window in a simple frame, a photograph of Calvin Ellington Booker, taken in 1978, standing in front of his first office on Compton Boulevard in a suit that did not quite fit, and an expression that suggested he understood exactly how much he was about to build, and was allowing himself 1 moment of private acknowledgement before getting back to work. James looked at the photograph for a long time. He did not say anything. He did not need to. Calvin had never needed words confirmed out loud either. It was, perhaps, the most significant thing the old man had passed down. On his way out, James stopped at the Ring. He had called a jeweller on Wilshire that morning, a quiet firm that did estate documentation and appraisals for trust attorneys, the kind of place that did not ask unnecessary questions. He dropped off the engagement ring in a small envelope, requested a formal appraisal for estate documentation purposes, and was told it would be ready in 5 business days. He thanked them and left. He drove the Camry home through the early evening traffic on Crenshaw, and on impulse, or what looked like impulse, he pulled into the parking lot of the barber shop 3 blocks from the house. The sign in the window still had the hand-lettered hours that had been there since the previous owner. Inside it smelled like warm Clippers and Murrays and the specific comfortable noise of men who had known each other long enough to argue without consequence. He sat in the chair. He got his hair cut. He talked about nothing. A game that had been disappointing. The heat a cousin someone had run into at the grocery store. He said nothing about the folder, nothing about Patricia, Nothing about Roland or Meridian Pacific or the vendor review that was already in motion across town. He tipped well, said good night, and drove home. Across town at that exact moment, Terrell Chambers's phone was ringing with a call from Meridian Pacific's operations director. A call Terrell would answer in the easy, confident way of a man who had not yet learned that the ground beneath him was no longer solid. The first domino fell on a Tuesday. Meridian Pacific Construction received the vendor review notification from Ellington Systems Group's infrastructure division that same morning. A standard letter, corporate letterhead, no urgency communicated, no explanation offered beyond the language of routine quarterly assessment. Their preferred contractor status was under review. All pending project allocations were paused pending outcome. Meridian Pacific called Chambers Premier Build by noon. Terrell did not understand what he was hearing. He asked the operations director to repeat himself. The man repeated himself. $6.1 million in contracted work, 3 active project allocations and 2 pending awards. Suspended indefinitely, pending a vendor review that had no stated timeline and no stated criteria. Terrell told himself it was temporary, a formality. These things happened. He was wrong. By the end of the first week, it was clear the review was not moving. No timeline had been communicated. No contact person had been named. Meridian Pacific's own inquiries to Ellington Systems went unanswered at the project manager level, escalated, and were then answered with the particular corporate politeness that means nothing is coming. Terrell's quarterly revenue projection collapsed like a building with no foundation. $6.1 million gone in 30 days. He needed a bridge loan. He went to 4 banks. He had relationships at 2 of them, or believed he did. The first bank told him the application was under review. A week passed, then another. The calls stopped being returned. The second bank told him the same. The third bank, a mid-sized commercial lender he had used twice before for equipment financing, ran his application through their institutional risk committee and came back with a soft decline, no hard reasons stated. 3 of the 4 banks held existing institutional relationships with Ellington Systems Group. Not one of them said so. Not one of them needed to. The 4th bank approved a partial line, a fraction of what he needed. It wasn't enough. Terrell started making calls he had never had to make before. Suppliers he owed, subcontractors waiting on payment. He pushed every deadline he could push and called in every favor he had accumulated over 4 years of telling people how successful he was. The favors were smaller than he remembered. Then the letter arrived at Loretta's house. It came on a Wednesday morning, certified mail, from the collections division of the commercial lending institution that held the $2.3 million business line of credit that Loretta had co-signed for her son 3 years ago because she believed in him without reservation. The letter was not a warning, it was a demand, payment in full within 30 days due to default on the primary obligation. Loretta called Vanessa before she had finished reading it. Vanessa called her attorney within the hour. Her attorney, a sharp, efficient woman named Candice, who had handled dozens of divorce asset cases and had seen most things, had already filed the formal asset discovery inquiry into James Ellington Booker's holdings as part of standard divorce proceedings. The inquiry had gone out 2 weeks prior. The response had come back that morning and was sitting in Candice's inbox when Vanessa called. Candice opened it while they were on the phone. She stopped talking mid-sentence. The silence lasted long enough that Vanessa asked if she was still there. Candice was still there. She was reading. She read for another 45 seconds without speaking, which was 45 seconds longer than she had ever gone silent in a phone call in her professional career. Then she told Vanessa she needed to call her back. She needed a few minutes to verify what she was looking at. She called back in 11 minutes. Ellington Systems Group. $46.7 billion in combined technology portfolio valuation. Sole beneficial owner, the Booker Ellington Family Trust. Sole Trust Director, James Ellington Booker. Vanessa did not respond. She did not respond for 4 days. She did not return her mother's calls. She did not respond to Terrell's increasingly desperate messages in the family group chat. She sat with what she had been told the way a person sits, with something that cannot be put back the way it was because it cannot. The group chat, for its part, had already gone quiet. Terrell had stopped posting. Loretta had stopped her daily good morning messages. The usual flow of memes and prayer requests and children's photos had slowed to almost nothing, as if the family's digital nervous system had registered that something was wrong before anyone had said so directly. Then the Los Angeles Business Journal published the feature. Ellington Systems Group was breaking ground on a $2.1 billion federal data infrastructure campus. The location, Inglewood, California. The profile ran with a photograph of the trust director, James Ellington Booker, standing outside the Grand Avenue office, in his navy blazer, looking directly at the camera with the expression of a man who had always known exactly who he was. The DJ from the reunion saw it first. He sent the link to the family group chat at 7:43 in the morning with no caption. Nobody responded, not immediately, not for a long time. Terrell called James that afternoon. James looked at his phone. He watched Terrell's name on the screen until the call went to voicemail. Then he set the phone face down on his desk and went back to work. He did not call back. 3 days later, Vanessa Chambers Booker drove to the building on Grand Avenue for the first time in 9 years of marriage, parked in the structure across the street, walked through the lobby, and asked the receptionist for James Ellington Booker by name. James was already expecting her. The building on Grand Avenue did not announce itself. There was no Ellington Systems sign in the lobby, no corporate branding on the elevator directory. Just a suite number on the 14th floor, and a receptionist who looked up when Vanessa walked in and said without hesitation, without consulting anything, "Good morning, Miss Chambers. Mr. Booker is expecting you. I'll let Roland know you're here." Vanessa stopped walking. She had not given her name at the security desk downstairs. She had not called ahead. She had simply driven here, parked in the structure across the street, and walked through the front door on the momentum of 4 days of silence and a photograph in a business journal that had rearranged everything she thought she understood about the last 9 years of her life. The receptionist smiled pleasantly and reached for the phone. Roland Pitts appeared 90 seconds later. He was the man in the charcoal suit, the man from the doorway, the man who had nodded at James from across a banquet hall full of people, while Terrell had a microphone and Vanessa had been laughing. Roland greeted her by name a second time and walked her down a hallway that was quiet and carpeted and lined with the kind of framed technical certifications and government contract seals that communicated without drama an extraordinary level of institutional credibility. He showed her into the conference room and told her James would be right with her. She stood for a moment before she sat down. The room was clean and orderly and serious. The table was long. The chairs were real leather. Through the window she could see the downtown skyline settling into the white morning light, and for a moment she had the specific disorientation of someone who has walked into a room that disproves something they were certain of, and cannot yet locate the words for what they were wrong about. James came in and closed the door behind him. He was wearing the same kind of thing he always wore. Navy blazer, white shirt, no tie. He looked exactly as he had looked at every Chambers family dinner for 9 years. He sat down across from her and folded his hands on the table and waited. He was not angry. That was the thing that hit her first and hardest. There was no fury in him, no coldness, no visible satisfaction. He simply looked at her the way a man looks at something he has already made his peace with and is now simply completing the final formality of. Vanessa tried confusion first. She gestured at the room, at the hallway, at the general fact of the building, and said she didn't understand how any of this was possible. How long had this existed? Why he had never told her? James let her finish. He did not answer. She shifted. She became Vanessa the attorney then, precise, transactional, talking about the discovery filing, about the trust structure, about what she was and was not legally entitled to, and what her attorney had and had not confirmed. She talked about what a reasonable settlement would look like going forward, and her voice had the professional steadiness of a woman trying to establish control of a room she had already lost. James waited for that to finish too. Then she went quiet, and in the quiet, something underneath all the posturing surfaced. Not quite remorse, but the cousin of it. The recognition that she had miscalculated something fundamental, and that the miscalculation had a face, and it was sitting across the table from her. James let that sit. Then he spoke. He spoke the way he had always spoken, quietly, without performance, each word placed with the care of a man who had thought about this for a long time, and did not intend to waste any of it. He said 9 years was a long time to sit at someone's dinner table and be discussed like a problem that hadn't been solved yet. He said he had heard every version of what they thought of him, from Loretta's polite Thanksgiving cruelties to Terrell's annual microphone performances to the specific silence Vanessa chose every single time she could have said something and didn't. He said he had made a choice early on to let people be exactly who they were going to be, because he had learned from a man far wiser than any of them that character is the one thing that reveals itself without being asked. He said his grandfather had built something that no one in the Chambers family had ever thought to ask about, because asking would have required believing the answer might be bigger than what they had already decided. He talked about the Camry. He said the Camry was a choice. He said he drove it because Calvin had driven a used Buick for 30 years after he had more money than he would ever spend, because Calvin believed that a man who needed his car to tell people who he was had confused the symbol for the thing itself. Then he said the thing that had been waiting 9 years to be said. He said, "You let your brother take that microphone and tell 200 people I wasn't man enough for you, and you stood up and handed him the room. But what you didn't know was that every dollar Terrell ever made, calling himself self-made, was poured into concrete that only exists because my grandfather's company needed somewhere to put its servers." Vanessa did not move. She opened her mouth once. Nothing came out that worked. Not a rebuttal, not an explanation, not anything that could survive contact with what had just been said to her in that quiet, unhurried voice. James reached into the inside pocket of his blazer. He set the engagement ring on the conference table. He did not slide it across aggressively. He simply placed it in front of her with the particular finality of a man returning something to its correct owner. Not the ring, but the meaning of it. He stood up. He thanked her for coming. He walked to the door and opened it. Vanessa picked up the ring. She walked out without speaking. She passed Roland's desk and the frame certifications and the receptionist, who had known her name, and took the elevator down to the lobby and walked across the street to the parking structure and sat in her car. She sat there for 40 minutes. The parking structure had a clear view of the Ellington Systems lobby through the glass. She watched people move through it the entire time. 6 months after the divorce was finalized, the Chambers family group chat still had not recovered. It was not that anyone had left it. Nobody had left it. They were all still there. Loretta, Terrell, Vanessa, the cousins, the aunts, the uncle, who only ever posted Bible verses on Sunday mornings. They were all still technically present. But the particular energy that had made the chat feel alive, the daily good morning messages, the food pictures, the running commentary on whatever game was on, had gone quiet in the way a room goes quiet after something irreversible has been said inside it. Nobody posted about Terrell's business. There was nothing to post. Chambers' Premier Build had filed for Chapter 11, protection 11 weeks after the reunion. The filing was not dramatic. It was a document, a process, a set of numbers that no longer added up, no matter how Terrell arranged them. $6.1 million in lost contract revenue. A $2.3 million collections demand that Loretta could not absorb without selling the house in Baldwin Hills. The house she had moved into 3 years ago, the house that was evidence, she had believed, of what it looked like when a family raised its children right. The house sold in 4 weeks. Terrell moved into the spare room of his cousin Deshawn's house in Hawthorne and told anyone who asked that it was temporary. Deshawn did not ask. The self-made mythology was over, not with a fight, not with a confrontation, but with the slow, airless deflation of a story that had run out of room to breathe. The family knew what they knew. Nobody needed to say it out loud. That was, in some ways, the worst part for Terrell. Not that people were talking about it, but that they had stopped. The divorce settlement was finalized in the same month. Patricia Hargrove had structured the asset disclosures with the precision that characterized everything she did, and the result was exactly what the law and the trust documents required. Fair, clean, and significantly smaller than Vanessa had anticipated when she had still believed James was a man with nothing. The Booker-Ellington family trust was irrevocable and predated the marriage by decades. Vanessa received a settlement based on the marital estate proper, the house, the joint accounts, the assets accumulated in 9 years of shared life. It was not nothing, but it was not $46.7 billion, and the distance between those two numbers was the precise measure of how badly her assumptions had failed her. She did not contest it. Candace, her attorney, had advised against contesting it. Candace had read the trust documents 3 times. She had nothing to contest it with. 3 months after that, on a Saturday morning in early spring, James stood at a podium 2 miles from the Century Boulevard Banquet Hall, where a DJ had gone silent and a ring had been placed on a table in front of 200 people who had already made up their minds about him. The Calvin Ellington Booker Foundation had been established with a $12 million endowment drawn from the Trust's discretionary fund. Its purpose was narrow and specific: full-ride STEM scholarships for students from South Los Angeles, with preference given to first-generation college students and students from the neighborhoods that Calvin Ellington Booker had grown up in, worked in, and never left in any way that mattered, even after he had the means to go anywhere he wanted. The ceremony was held outside. It was a warm morning, the kind of early spring morning in Los Angeles, where the light is so clean it makes everything look like it was built yesterday. There were students there, 12 of them, the first cohort, each of them with a folder in their hands and an expression that James recognized because he had worn it himself once, standing on a porch on Hooper Avenue with 2 glasses of lemonade and the specific weight of understanding that something large had just been placed in his care. He kept his remarks short. He talked about Calvin. He talked about the kind of man who builds something so solid it outlives him by decades and still has room to grow. He did not talk about Vanessa or Terrell or the reunion or the ring. None of that belonged here. This was not about any of that. After the ceremony, he was approached by a woman he had not met before. She introduced herself as Diane Okafor. a structural engineer whose firm had consulted on the load-bearing specifications for the Inglewood Federal Campus. She had attended the ceremony because her firm's project lead had passed along the invitation, and she had come because she believed in showing up for things that were trying to do something real in a neighborhood that deserved it. She asked him one question. Not about the trust, not about the valuation, not about any of the things people had been trying to ask him about for 3 months. She asked him what Calvin had been like as a person. James considered the question the way he considered everything, carefully, without rushing it. He told her Calvin had been the quietest man he had ever known, who always said exactly what he meant. Diane said that sounded like someone worth knowing. James agreed that it was. They did not exchange numbers. They did not make plans. They stood in the morning light for a few minutes longer, and then the ceremony moved on, and the moment passed the way good moments pass, cleanly, without forcing itself. That evening, James drove back to the office on Grand Avenue. He finished the last items on his desk, organized tomorrow's calendar, and turned off the lamp. He stood in the dark for a moment, the only light coming from the window, the city moving below him with its usual indifference. He thought about Calvin. He thought about a man who had spent his life building something no one could see, for a grandson who would spend his life doing the same, because they both understood that a man who knows what he is worth never needs to announce it. He simply waits for the room to catch up. James locked the office door, found the stairwell, and walked down. Now, if you made it to the end of this story, ask yourself this. If you had been in James's position, if you had held that kind of power quietly for that long while people dismissed you publicly, what would you have done? Would you have revealed it sooner? Would you have walked away without a word? Let us know in the comments, because that conversation is always worth having. If this story moved you, if it satisfied something, tap the like button. It takes 1 second, and it helps more people find stories like this one. And if you are not subscribed yet, do it now, because we are back every week with more stories about quiet strength, hidden power, and the specific satisfaction of watching the truth arrive exactly when it is supposed to. We will see you in the next one.